The stunning new details in the Hillary Clinton email scandal. It comes courtesy of the first sworn testimony from a member of her inner circle, Cheryl Mills, who served as Clinton's chief of staff at the State Department. In newly released transcripts from a deposition conducted Friday, Mills repeatedly refusing to answer questions about the role of computer specialist Brian Pagliano in arranging Clinton's private server. Mills also partly blaming the Benghazi terrorist attack for why Clinton failed to turn over her emails as she left office in 2013, as she was required to do so under the law, saying, quote, "We had lost our first ambassador in quite some time, and we were stepping through the sets of issues associated with that. And she, too, had fallen ill, and there had been a period of time where we were obviously navigating a whole set of issues in that space." Mills' deposition came in a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit brought by Judicial Watch. The conservative watchdog group's director of research and investigations had this to say about her testimony.
Nonsense. I mean, they absconded with records. They knew when they left office they were taking federal government records with them. They hid them essentially for 2 years. I guess you're supposed to feel sympathetic or sorry for them, but it just doesn't line up with the facts. It's gamesmanship.
7 hours of testimony. What did you make of it, Judge?
The legal bad news for Mrs. Clinton continues to cascade upon her. She hasn't had a breath of fresh air or good news from her legal side since the secret server was discovered. But we learned some interesting things yesterday. Mrs. Clinton, in the 4 years that she was Secretary of State, only used her BlackBerry. She did not use a laptop. She did not use a desktop. She didn't use a tablet. She only used her BlackBerry wherever she was. Guess where BlackBerries don't work? They are disabled by order of the IT people on the 7th floor of the State Department. Where was her office? On the 7th floor of the State Department.
That doesn't make any sense.
So the Secretary of State of the United States, in charge of diplomatic affairs around the globe, when she wants to communicate directly with one of her ambassadors, has to leave her office surrounded by a cordon of guards and aides, go down to the 6th floor, and then respond to emails. This is absurd.
Okay, that just seems, yeah, that's nonsensical to me.
All of this because she refused to use, they asked her several times, a government-issued BlackBerry because she knew that would be subject to the Freedom of Information Act.
So, Judge, wasn't this maybe not commensurate, but there was some conversation I remember early on with President Obama and the use of a BlackBerry. What is the deal? Inside Washington,
Oh, I can tell you. I mean, BlackBerries are traditionally more secure. I mean, IT people think that they're harder to break into, that the iPhone, it's easier for hackers to get inside, and within the government for years they've stuck to the BlackBerry. But, I mean, I don't...
Well, if she had used a government-issued BlackBerry, it would not have been disabled on the 7th floor. It's because she used her own BlackBerry tied into her server in Chappaqua that it was
Okay, but what about, I mean, the critics today are saying, after reviewing this 7 hours of testimony, the first in this, saying denial, denial, denial. And you look at the excuse that they're using, Benghazi, Judge. What do you make of that?
Well, Benghazi occurred 2.5 years after she began using the secret server. So there's really no argument, no tenable argument to be made there. As I understood the argument in a light most favorable to Cheryl Mills, they were so taken aback by the events of Benghazi. This is September 2012. She's out of office 5 months later, that they neglected to turn over all the emails when they left office. Quite frankly, that's nonsense. The reason they didn't turn over all the emails is because the emails weren't there. They were in the server in Chappaqua, and Mrs. Clinton, again, was terrified of people knowing, as they have a legal right to do, what she was writing and to whom she was writing it while she was Secretary of State.
And then, Jedediah, I want to get you in here. Ms. Mills' lawyer, Beth A. Wilkinson, was obviously there with her, repeatedly clashed with the Judicial Watch lawyers during the 7 hours of testimony, saying their questions were beyond the scope of what the judge had allowed. You can't ask that.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that going on.
Yeah, she doesn't... This is a really difficult issue for her. She doesn't want to answer these questions because either she's completely corrupt or she's completely, you know, inept. And even if Benghazi happened at the same time, even if the argument was, well, there was this flood of Benghazi, you're telling me that the State Department is ill-prepared then to both follow the law and to handle a tragedy that occurs where you have to, I mean, so what is it? Are you corrupt? Are you hiding something? Is there a potential indictment that's going to happen here? Or are you telling us that you were just incapable of doing your job and you weren't familiar with the law? Either way, this doesn't look good for her. There's no escape route here.
I thought another really surprising thing that came out during the testimony was the fact that they said they never considered the idea of how they would comply with the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, this came about because of Watergate, because people out there knew, I mean, you knew that you had to have transparency and for government workers to show what they were doing. They didn't even consider how they would comply with this law at all. That's a really important difference.
A very interesting question that was put to her was were Mrs. Clinton's emails searchable for Freedom of Information Act purposes?
Right.
Because Mrs. Clinton has told several press conferences the answer to that was yes. Ms. Mills said the answer to that was no. It was impossible to search for her emails on her private server using the Freedom of Information Act folks at the State Department.
Are you all that surprised that there is such inconsistency on important points between Hillary Clinton and the people who worked for her? Now, we don't know exactly what Abedin has said, but this is a pretty critical point where these women don't come together on the facts.
You know, they have, it's a great question, and this is very unusual what they've done. They have the same lawyer. Beth Wilkerson represents all of Mrs. Clinton's aides. Sometimes the Justice Department will not let you do that because they know there's a difference
so why
in
don't
interests
the facts
among.
match?
I guess they didn't clarify things ahead of time.
I want to ask you about negligence because that's been I've seen it hashtagged, and negligence and intent.
Okay.
Where this comes into play.
Well, the most serious potential charge against Mrs. Clinton is espionage, which is the failure to keep safe state secrets that have been entrusted to you for safekeeping. And federal crimes, the government has to show intent. That is, you intended to expose them.
Whether they're marked or not, is how I've read it.
Except for espionage, it's not an intent crime. The government can prove to a jury that espionage was committed by showing gross negligence. Gross negligence is the failure to take care of something with the really strong belief that a bad thing will happen if you don't take care of it. So simple negligence is driving along the street behind us at 30 miles an hour and hoping you don't hit anybody. Gross negligence is driving along the street at 90 miles an hour and hoping you don't.
So let me give you what Cheryl Mills went on the record in this testimony as saying about intent. She said the use of Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server was absolutely not an attempt to evade the Freedom of Information Act, and that's under oath the first time we are hearing sworn-in testimony.
That is defied by an email from Huma Abedin, in which Mrs. Clinton was offered a BlackBerry when the server went down. So not only do we have the 7th floor stuff where the BlackBerry doesn't work, but sometimes the server in Chappaqua went down, so the BlackBerry didn't work anywhere. Right. So the IT people, that would be Brian Pagliano, said, Madam Secretary, here's one that will work. And
wait a minute, this is a lot of devices now.
Yes, and Uma sends an email to Pagliano and to other IT people saying, we can't have that because whatever she says on that would be subject to the Freedom of Information Act.
Oh, interesting. And the other thing, too, is that with Pagliano, with all these different devices, now we know how they were able to trace the emails between her and Brian Pagliano, but they weren't on her server because they got sent to him.
Wow. Listen, there are some funny things that happened. You know, she sent an email to a very close friend, and then her computer went down. The close friend responded. The email came back to the responder, so the close friend called the State Department's main switchboard saying, would you please use this email for Mrs. Clinton?
You can't make it up.
This story keeps changing fast, and we're on it. And you've been on this story with us from the beginning, Judge.
It's a lot of reading.